The cold mountain air bit through Ezekiel Cooper's worn leather coat as he stood on the rickety porch of his isolated cabin. At 52, his weathered face told stories of hardship that words could never fully capture. Deep lines carved by sun, wind, and heartbreak. His once imposing 6'3" frame remained strong, but slightly stooped now, like a great pine beginning to bend after decades of standing tall against relentless storms. 20 years in these Colorado mountains had turned his once dark hair and beard a steely gray, matching the permanent winter that seemed to have settled in his pale blue eyes. As he surveyed the rugged landscape that had been both his prison and sanctuary since the war, he clutched the letter that would change everything. His mail-order bride would arrive on tomorrow's stage. "Damn fool idea," he muttered, his breath forming clouds in the crisp autumn air. "I'd like to take a moment to ask you kindly to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'm curious, what city are you watching from today?" Ezekiel had never planned on companionship again, not after losing his family during the war. Their small farm in Tennessee had been caught in the crossfire between Union and Confederate forces, while he was away fighting, believing he was protecting them. By the time he returned, there was nothing left but scorched earth and 3 simple graves dug by neighbors who couldn't look him in the eye. He'd wandered west afterward, leaving behind his name, his past, and eventually settling in this remote valley where the townsfolk from Silver Ridge rarely ventured. Here he built a life of solitude, hunting, trapping, occasionally trading furs and meat in town when absolutely necessary. The locals called him Mountain Cooper, or just the Mountain Man, most having forgotten his first name entirely. Some mothers warned their children about the wild, bearded recluse in the hills, while others whispered that he'd once been a feared gunslinger or Confederate officer. Ezekiel let them talk. Their fear ensured his privacy. Yet something had broken inside him last winter. The isolation that had once been balm to his wounded soul had become a different kind of prison. During a particularly vicious blizzard, he'd fallen ill with fever and had lain in his cabin for 3 days, delirious and alone, certain he would die there, with no one to mark his passing. When he'd recovered, a strange new fear had taken root, not of death, but of complete erasure, as if he'd never existed at all. It was this fear that had led him, during his spring journey to town for supplies, to respond to an advertisement in the Silver Ridge Gazette. Respectable Eastern ladies seeking Western husbands for new beginnings. Inquire at post office. In a moment of weakness, or perhaps clarity, Ezekiel had written to the address provided. His letter had been brief, honest about his circumstances, if not his past, offering a hard but stable life to any woman brave or desperate enough to accept. He'd nearly forgotten about it until 2 months later, when a reply came from a Miss Charlotte Burke of Boston, Massachusetts. Her letter had been surprisingly straightforward. 32 years old, never married, with no family remaining after losing her parents to influenza. She described herself as educated but practical, willing to work hard and seeking a fresh start away from painful memories and limited prospects. Something in her direct tone had resonated with him. No flowery language or false promises, just 2 wounded souls possibly finding use in each other. So he'd sent train fare and directions. Half convinced she would never actually appear, now with her arrival imminent, Ezekiel felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: genuine anxiety. His gaze swept across his humble homestead with new eyes. The cabin was solid enough, built by his own hands from local pine, with a stone fireplace that kept it warm through brutal mountain winters. He'd added a second room last month, partitioned with a homemade door that still didn't hang quite right. His few possessions were meticulously organized. Tools, weapons, preserved food, all with the precision of a man whose survival depended on order. The land itself was beautiful, if unforgiving. 20 acres of mixed forest and meadow, nestled in a valley between towering peaks, with a clear stream running along the eastern edge. He'd cultivated a small vegetable garden that produced enough through the shorter growing season to supplement his hunting. 3 horses grazed in a corral near the barn, where he kept his wagon and minimal farming equipment. It wasn't much compared to what some men could offer, but it was his, paid for in sweat and solitude. As twilight approached, Ezekiel moved inside to make final preparations. He'd spent days cleaning, repaired the roof, built a proper bed frame to replace his simple pallet, even managed to acquire a small mirror from town. On his last supply run, he'd spent precious dollars on items he'd never bothered with before. An extra blanket with less patching, a new tin of coffee, a bar of scented soap that now sat untouched by the washing basin. Small comforts for a woman leaving behind civilization for a life with a stranger. Morning came with a clarity that only mountain air can bring. Ezekiel rose before dawn, as was his habit, but today followed an unusual routine. He heated water and shaved his beard to a more manageable length, trimmed his hair as best he could, and donned his least worn clothes, a clean flannel shirt and the dark trousers he normally saved for his infrequent trips to town. At first light, he hitched his more docile mare to the wagon and began the 2-hour journey down the mountain trail to Silver Ridge. The town had grown considerably in the 15 years since he'd first arrived in the territory. What had once been little more than a trading post had expanded to a proper settlement after silver was discovered in the nearby hills. Now it boasted several streets lined with false-fronted buildings, a hotel, general store, 2 saloons, a small church, and even a schoolhouse. The stage line had been established 5 years prior, bringing regular mail service and occasional travelers from Denver and points east. As Ezekiel guided his wagon down the main street toward the stage depot, he felt the familiar discomfort of being watched. Townsfolk paused in their morning activities to stare at the rare sight of the mountain recluse, whispering behind hands as he passed. He ignored them, as always, focusing instead on the anxiety gnawing at his gut. The weight of what he'd done, inviting a stranger into his carefully constructed isolation, suddenly seemed like madness. What did he know about being a husband again? What could he possibly offer this woman, besides shelter and food? At the depot, he positioned his wagon in the shade and waited, watching the distant trail for signs of the approaching stagecoach. Noon came and went with no sign of the stage, which wasn't unusual given the rough mountain roads. By mid-afternoon, Ezekiel had taken to pacing, ignoring the curious glances from the depot manager and the small crowd of locals who always gathered to meet the stage, hoping for mail or news from the outside world. When the distant sound of hoofs and wheels finally broke the afternoon quiet, Ezekiel felt his heart hammer against his ribs. The coach appeared around the bend in a cloud of dust, the driver calling out to his tired team as they made their final approach. It rocked to a stop before the platform, and the driver secured the brake before jumping down to open the door. 2 men in business attire emerged first, followed by an elderly couple who were immediately greeted by waiting family members. And then she appeared in the doorway, hesitating before accepting the driver's hand down. A slender woman in a simple blue traveling dress, a small hat perched atop honey-brown hair that was coming loose from its pins after the long journey. Charlotte Burke stood uncertainly on the platform, one gloved hand clutching a worn leather suitcase, the other holding a paper that must have contained his description. Her gaze moved over the gathered crowd, clearly searching for the man who had sent for her. Ezekiel remained frozen for a moment, struck by the reality of her presence. She wasn't what he'd expected, though he realized he hadn't known what to expect. Not a great beauty by conventional standards, but there was something striking in her features. High cheekbones, a determined chin, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Most noticeable was the wariness in her posture, like a deer ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. It was a feeling Ezekiel understood all too well. Finding his courage, he stepped forward, removing his hat as he approached the platform. "Miss Burke?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Her eyes found his, a startling amber color that reminded him of autumn leaves. And he saw the moment of recognition, followed immediately by something like shock, quickly masked. "Mr. Cooper?" she responded with a slight nod, her accent unmistakably Eastern, but her voice steadier than he might have expected. An awkward silence stretched between them as they studied each other. Up close, he could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes and the weariness of long travel in the slight slump of her shoulders. She was older than the girls who typically came west as brides, yet still younger than him by a good 20 years. For her part, Charlotte seemed to be cataloging his appearance with equal attention, perhaps noting his height, the strength still evident in his frame despite his age, the scars visible on his hands, and the one that cut through his left eyebrow. Whatever she saw caused her to straighten her spine and lift her chin slightly, as if coming to some private decision. "I have another trunk," she said, nodding toward where the driver was unloading luggage from the boot of the coach. Ezekiel nodded and moved to retrieve it, grateful for the momentary reprieve from her direct gaze. The return journey to the cabin was marked by long stretches of silence, broken by occasional necessary conversation. Charlotte sat beside him on the wagon seat, her posture rigid despite the rough trail that jostled them constantly. "The land is beautiful," she remarked as they climbed higher into the mountains, the vast expanse of forest and distant peaks spread before them. "Harsh in winter," he responded, feeling the inadequacy of his words, "but peaceful." She nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I don't mind harsh," she said after a while. "Boston winters aren't gentle either." Something in her tone made him glance sideways at her profile. The setting sun caught the gold flecks in her amber eyes, and for a moment he glimpsed something familiar, a resilience born of suffering. "No," he agreed quietly, returning his attention to the trail. "Expect they aren't." By the time they reached the cabin, dusk had settled over the valley. Ezekiel lit lanterns while Charlotte stood in the center of the main room, taking in what would be her new home. He watched her expression carefully, trying to read her thoughts as her gaze traveled over the rough-hewn furniture, the stone fireplace, the shelves stocked with provisions. "It's not much," he said, suddenly aware of the cabin's shortcomings. "But it's solid, keeps the weather out." Charlotte removed her gloves slowly, then her hat, setting them aside on the table. "It's more than I expected," she replied, and he couldn't tell if that was good or bad. She moved to the fireplace, extending her hands toward the warmth of the banked coals he'd left that morning. "May I see the rest?" He nodded, awkwardly showing her the small bedroom he'd prepared for her, the storage room, the outdoor facilities. She asked practical questions about water, winter preparations, the garden, and he answered each with growing surprise at her apparent lack of dismay. Later, after a simple meal of venison stew he'd prepared before leaving that morning, they sat across from each other at the wooden table he'd crafted years ago. The lantern between them cast soft shadows across Charlotte's face as she sipped the coffee he'd brewed. "We should discuss expectations," she said suddenly, setting down her cup with deliberate care. "I believe in plain speaking, Mr. Cooper." Ezekiel felt a knot form in his stomach, but nodded for her to continue. "I came here for security and a fresh start," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I understand this arrangement is practical rather than romantic. I'm prepared to be a good wife, to cook, clean, help with the land, provide companionship. In return, I expect fair treatment, safety, and—" she hesitated for the first time, "mutual respect for boundaries, at least until we know each other better." The knot in Ezekiel's stomach loosened slightly. "Seems reasonable," he replied, finding unexpected relief in her directness. "I ain't looking for a servant, though. This life is hard enough with two sharing the work." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "As for the other matter, I won't press you. Wouldn't be right." Color rose in Charlotte's cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "Thank you for that consideration." Silence fell between them again, more comfortable than before. After a moment, Ezekiel cleared his throat. "There's something else you should know." He hesitated, then continued with effort. "Town folks, they don't come up here much, don't particularly like me. Been alone a long time, and that's how they prefer it. Might make things difficult for you by association." Charlotte's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes. "I didn't come west expecting social calls and tea parties, Mr. Cooper." A hint of bitterness colored her words. "I've had my fill of people's judgments." She looked down at her hands, now clasped tightly on the table. "We all have reasons for seeking new beginnings in remote places." Ezekiel studied her, feeling the weight of unspoken histories between them. "We should get some rest," he finally said, standing from the table. "Been a long day for you. I'll sleep in the barn tonight. Give you time to settle in." Charlotte looked up sharply. "That isn't necessary. I wouldn't displace you from your home on the first night." He shook his head, already moving toward the door. "Got plenty of nights ahead to figure things out. Barn's comfortable enough." He paused at the threshold, hat in hand. "Good night, Miss Burke." She nodded slowly. "Good night, Mr. Cooper." The following days established a cautious rhythm between them. Charlotte proved surprisingly adaptable to cabin life, taking over cooking duties and organization of the household with quiet efficiency. Ezekiel showed her the practical aspects of mountain living, where to find the best water, which plants were safe to gather, how to spot signs of approaching weather changes. They worked side by side preparing for winter, preserving the last of the garden harvest, repairing tools, and chopping endless cords of firewood. At night, true to his word, Ezekiel continued to sleep in the small loft area of the barn, returning to the cabin at dawn to find Charlotte already awake and preparing breakfast. Their conversations remained practical, focused on tasks and necessities, though occasionally they would share small details from their presents, never their pasts. He learned she enjoyed reading and had brought several books in her trunk. She discovered his unexpected skill at carving, evidenced by the intricate details on the cabin's furniture. 2 weeks after Charlotte's arrival, they made their first journey to town together for supplies. Ezekiel had been dreading this necessity, knowing the scrutiny they would face. As they drove the wagon down the main street, the reaction was immediate. Conversations halting, heads turning, whispers following in their wake. At the general store, the proprietor's wife, Mrs. Hollister, made a show of welcoming Charlotte while pointedly ignoring Ezekiel. "My dear, we were so curious when we heard Mountain Cooper had sent for a bride. Some of us ladies were concerned. You understand." Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she glanced between them. "If you ever need assistance, you just come into town and ask." Charlotte's spine stiffened almost imperceptibly. "How kind," she replied, in a tone that suggested anything but gratitude. "But Mr. Cooper has been nothing but considerate. I'm quite satisfied with my situation." As they continued gathering supplies, Ezekiel noticed Charlotte's increasing discomfort under the town's collective gaze. Outside the mercantile, they encountered Sheriff Taylor, a man who had made his dislike of Ezekiel clear over the years. "Ma'am," he acknowledged Charlotte with a tip of his hat before turning cold eyes toward Ezekiel. "Cooper, surprised to see you in town again so soon." Ezekiel merely nodded, placing a protective hand at Charlotte's elbow to guide her toward their wagon. The sheriff followed, his voice pitched to Carrie. "Ma'am, I feel obliged to mention that your husband has quite a reputation in these parts. Not much known about him before he showed up, and he's kept to himself since. Makes folks wonder what a man's hiding." Charlotte paused, turning to face the lawman with surprising composure. "In my experience, Sheriff, people often mistake a desire for privacy with something sinister. Good day to you." The ride back to the cabin was tense, Charlotte sitting rigidly beside him, her face unreadable. Only when the town was well behind them did she speak. "They're afraid of you." It wasn't a question. Ezekiel kept his eyes on the trail. "People fear what they don't understand. Easier that way sometimes." Charlotte studied his profile. "And do you encourage that fear?" He considered her question carefully. "Don't discourage it," he admitted. "Keeps them at a distance, keeps things simple." She nodded slowly. "I understand the appeal of being left alone." After another long silence, she added softly, "But it's a lonely way to live." Ezekiel had no response to that undeniable truth. That evening, as they unloaded supplies, Charlotte suddenly swayed on her feet, dropping a sack of flour. Ezekiel was at her side instantly, supporting her elbow as she pressed a hand to her forehead. "Just dizzy," she murmured, clearly embarrassed by the weakness. "The altitude, perhaps. I'm still adjusting." Despite her protests, he insisted she rest while he finished unloading. Later, he found her sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild evening temperature, staring out at the darkening forest. "May I join you?" he asked, remaining at a respectful distance. She nodded, and he settled onto the rough-hewn bench beside her, offering a cup of hot tea he'd prepared. "Thank you," she said, accepting it with hands that trembled slightly. "For the tea, and for earlier. I'm not usually—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I don't wish to be a burden." "You're not," Ezekiel said firmly. They sat in companionable silence as stars appeared in the vast mountain sky, brilliant and numerous in a way impossible to see from a city. "It's beautiful here," Charlotte whispered, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. "Sometimes I forget to notice," Ezekiel admitted. "Been here so long." She turned toward him, her face half illuminated by the lantern hanging beside the door. "Why did you come to these mountains, Mr. Cooper?" The question was gentle but direct, the first time either had broached the topic of the past. Ezekiel stared into the darkness, considering his answer. "After the war," he began slowly. "Couldn't go home. There was nothing, no one left to go back to." He felt rather than saw her nod of understanding. The mountains don't ask questions, don't expect explanations, just demand respect and hard work in exchange for solitude. Charlotte was quiet for so long he thought the conversation finished. Then, almost inaudibly, she said, "I was engaged once, in Boston." Ezekiel remained still, afraid any movement might stop her words. "A respectable match, the son of my father's business partner." She took a slow sip of tea. "When my parents died, I learned my father's business was failing, had been for years. The debts were—" She shook her head. "My fiancé broke the engagement within a week. His family couldn't risk the association." The bitterness in her voice was controlled, but unmistakable. "I took work as a seamstress, then a shop clerk, eventually a school teacher. But Boston is unforgiving. Some shadows are too large to escape except by leaving entirely." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting starlight. "So perhaps we're not so different, Mr. Cooper." As autumn deepened into winter, the physical distance between them gradually diminished. Practical necessity brought them into closer quarters as the first heavy snows arrived, making the trek to and from the barn increasingly difficult. "This is foolishness," Charlotte declared one evening, as Ezekiel prepared to trudge through knee-deep snow to his sleeping quarters. A blizzard had been raging all day, the wind howling around the cabin's sturdy walls. "You'll freeze before morning." Her concern appeared genuine, her normally composed features showing clear worry. "I've survived worse," he assured her, wrapping his heavy coat tighter. Charlotte stepped between him and the door, arms crossed. "The cabin is large enough for both of us to sleep with proper boundaries maintained. I insist you take the main room by the fire. I'll keep to my room." Her tone brooked no argument, reminding him that beneath her quiet demeanor lay a will as strong as his own. That night, Ezekiel slept before the fireplace on a pallet of blankets, listening to the storm and the occasional creaks from Charlotte's room, aware of her presence in a way that both comforted and unsettled him. The enforced proximity of winter days brought new dimensions to their relationship. With outdoor work limited by weather, they spent long hours in the cabin together. Charlotte established a small school area in one corner, determined to maintain her teaching skills by offering to improve Ezekiel's reading. Though initially resistant, he found himself enjoying their evening lessons beside the fire, her patient guidance helping him through books he'd never attempted before. In turn, he taught her practical mountain skills, how to repair tools, preserve meat, and recognize animal tracks in the snow. During a particularly fierce December storm that kept them homebound for 3 days, Charlotte discovered the chess set Ezekiel kept wrapped in cloth on a high shelf. "Do you play?" she asked, eyes brightening with interest. He nodded, somewhat embarrassed. "Learned as a boy. Haven't had an opponent in years." Her smile, still rare enough to catch him off guard, transformed her face. "Then you're long overdue for a match, Mr. Cooper." Those chess games became a nightly ritual, revealing new facets of both their personalities. Charlotte played with strategic patience, carefully considering each move. Ezekiel's style was more intuitive, occasionally making bold sacrifices that surprised her. They were evenly matched, their games often extending late into the evening as the fire burned low and snow piled against the windows. It was during one such game, with Christmas approaching, that Charlotte broached a subject they'd both avoided. "I believe we've known each other long enough to use first names, don't you?" she suggested, moving her bishop across the board. Unless you prefer the formality. Ezekiel looked up, startled by the simple proposal that somehow felt momentous. Been a long time since anyone called me Ezekiel, he admitted. Might take some getting used to. He moved his knight with deliberate care. But I'd like that, Charlotte. Christmas morning arrived with rare clarity after weeks of storms. Ezekiel woke before dawn, as was his habit, to find Charlotte already in the main room, tending the fire. "Merry Christmas," she said softly. Turning toward him with a tentative smile, he nodded, suddenly awkward, aware he had nothing to give her to mark the occasion. "I made something for you," she continued, retrieving a package wrapped in plain paper from beneath the small table. "It's not much, but—" Ezekiel accepted the parcel with calloused hands that suddenly felt too large and clumsy. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "Been working on it evenings," she explained, watching his face carefully. "For when you hunt in winter." He ran his fingers over the tight, even stitches, unexpectedly moved by the practical gift and the hours of work it represented. "Thank you," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. "I didn't think to—" Charlotte shook her head quickly. "I didn't expect anything in return." Still, later that day, Ezekiel disappeared into his workshop attached to the barn, returning at dusk with a small wooden box he'd been carving in secret moments over the past weeks. The simple pine container featured intricate patterns of mountain flowers along its edges. "For your sewing things," he explained gruffly, as Charlotte traced the detailed work with wondering fingers. "Or whatever you might need to keep safe." Their eyes met across the table, something unspoken passing between them. That evening, they shared their most elaborate meal since her arrival. A wild turkey Ezekiel had hunted the previous week, preserved vegetables from their garden, and a special treat of canned peaches he'd traded for during their last trip to town. As they sat by the fire afterward, a comfortable silence between them, Charlotte tentatively began singing a Christmas carol in a clear, sweet voice that filled the cabin. After a moment's hesitation, Ezekiel joined her with a deep baritone, surprising them both. Their voices blended in the ancient melodies, bridging the distance that remained between them. By February, the harshest cold had settled over the mountains, keeping them largely cabin-bound, save for essential trips to care for the livestock and check trap lines. On one such morning, with the temperature well below freezing and fresh snow blanketing the valley, Charlotte insisted on accompanying Ezekiel to check the nearest traps. "I need to learn everything about this life if I'm to be truly useful," she argued, already donning the heavy coat he'd found for her in town. "And I need fresh air before these walls close in completely." Reluctantly, he agreed, impressed despite his concern by how quickly she'd adapted to mountain winters. They trudged through snow that reached past their knees in places, Charlotte following carefully in the path he broke. The forest stood silent and transformed around them, trees heavy with snow, sunlight creating prisms of ice crystals in the air. Ezekiel found himself pointing out things he normally took for granted. The subtle tracks of a snowshoe hare, the distant silhouette of an eagle against the cloudless sky, the way certain trees bent with the weight of snow while others stood rigid. As they approached the creek, now mostly frozen, but still flowing beneath a layer of ice, Charlotte slipped on a hidden patch of ice. Ezekiel reached for her instinctively, catching her against his chest before she could fall. For a moment, they stood frozen, her gloved hands gripping his coat, faces inches apart, breath mingling in the cold air. Something shifted in his chest, a sensation long forgotten, both welcome and frightening. Charlotte's amber eyes widened slightly, perhaps recognizing the change in his expression. Slowly, deliberately, she regained her footing and stepped back, though her hands remained on his arms a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said softly, color rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. Ezekiel nodded wordlessly, turning to continue their trek with a new awareness humming between them. Later that evening, as they sat before the fire, with mugs of hot coffee laced with the last of his whiskey, Charlotte asked a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Ezekiel," she began, still sounding uncertain using his first name, "why did you send for a wife after all these years alone?" He stared into the flames, considering how to answer. The easy response would be practical. The need for help with the homestead, the advantages of shared labor. But something about the moment, or perhaps the whiskey warming his blood, pushed him toward honesty. "Last winter," he said slowly, "took ill during a storm. Bad fever. Lay here for days, no one knowing if I lived or died." He took a deep breath. "Made me think about endings, about leaving no mark on this world except an empty cabin that would eventually rot back into the earth." He glanced at her, then away. Foolish thought, maybe. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, firelight playing across her features. "Not foolish," she finally said. "We all want to matter somehow, to be remembered." She set her mug aside, turning more fully toward him. "I used to think it would be through children, a family to carry forward some piece of me." Sadness touched her voice. "At my age, that seems less likely now." Ezekiel looked at her, really looked at her, seeing beyond his initial impressions to the complex woman who had gradually revealed herself over these winter months. Intelligent, resilient, capable of both firmness and unexpected gentleness. "You're not so old," he said quietly. Her eyes met his, searching. "Nor are you," she replied, something like hope flickering briefly across her face before she looked away. That night, as they retired to their separate sleeping areas, Ezekiel lay awake long into the night, his thoughts more unsettled than they had been in years. March brought the first hints of spring to the high country. Longer days, occasional breaks in the snow, and the welcome sound of returning birds. With the thaw came renewed activity and preparations for the planting season ahead. Charlotte had taken charge of expanding the garden, carefully planning rows based on knowledge from her father's business that had apparently included seed trading. One unseasonably warm afternoon, as they worked together, turning the soil for new beds, Charlotte paused, leaning on her shovel as she surveyed the valley spread below them. "It really is beautiful here," she said, pushing a strand of honey-brown hair from her face. "I understand now why you chose this place." Ezekiel straightened, following her gaze across the landscape he knew by heart, yet still found breathtaking in moments like this. "Never planned to stay this long," he admitted. "Just kept finding reasons not to leave." Charlotte wiped her brow, studying his profile. "Will you tell me about them someday? Your family?" The question was gentle but direct, touching on the subject they'd both carefully avoided, despite their growing closeness. Ezekiel felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the protective wall rising around memories too painful to examine. Yet something had changed. Perhaps the months of shared work and quiet companionship, or the way Charlotte had never pushed or demanded his confidence. "Someday," he agreed softly, surprising himself. "Not today, but someday." She nodded, accepting this as enough, and they returned to their work, in companionable silence. That evening, Ezekiel moved his sleeping pallet from before the fireplace to a position closer to Charlotte's door, a small shift that nonetheless felt significant to them both. When the spring melt was fully underway, turning the mountain trails to mud and swelling the creek to a roaring torrent, Charlotte fell ill. What began as a slight cough worsened rapidly into fever and labored breathing that reminded Ezekiel terrifyingly of the influenza that had claimed her parents. For 3 days and nights, he barely left her side, applying cool compresses to her burning forehead, forcing her to drink willow bark tea when she was conscious enough to swallow, and praying to a God he'd long since stopped believing heard him. On the 4th morning, her fever broke, leaving her weak but lucid. "You didn't sleep," she whispered, noting his haggard appearance with concern, even in her depleted state. Ezekiel shook his head dismissively. "Doesn't matter." His large hand engulfed hers where it lay atop the blankets. "Thought I might lose you," he admitted, the fear still raw in his voice. Charlotte's fingers tightened weakly around his. "It would take more than a mountain fever to drive me from this home we've built," she said, a hint of her usual determination showing through her exhaustion. The words home and we hung in the air between them, new and significant. As she recovered over the following days, their relationship subtly transformed. Ezekiel found reasons to touch her, a hand at her elbow as she walked, fingers brushing as they passed tools between them, sitting close enough on the porch that their shoulders occasionally met. Charlotte responded in kind, no longer maintaining the careful distance that had marked their early months together. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the porch, she leaned against his side, her head coming to rest naturally on his shoulder. Neither mentioned this new development, but when Ezekiel placed his arm cautiously around her, Charlotte moved closer, fitting herself against him as if finding a place she belonged. By late April, the valley had transformed into a riot of wildflowers and new growth. Charlotte had recovered her strength, throwing herself into spring planting with renewed vigor. They had established a comfortable routine, working together during daylight hours and sharing quiet evenings with books, chess, or simply conversation. Ezekiel had begun sharing small stories from his past, nothing of the war or his losses, but childhood memories of Tennessee, fishing with his father, his mother's cooking. Charlotte reciprocated with tales of her Boston upbringing, her years as a teacher, the dreams she'd once held for a conventional life that now seemed distant and somewhat foreign. They had planned a trip to town for supplies, their first since winter had isolated them in their mountain sanctuary. The evening before their departure, as they sat beside each other on the porch bench that had become their favorite spot for watching daylight fade, Charlotte turned to face him with unusual seriousness. "There's something I need to tell you before we go to town," she said, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Something you should have known before any of this." Ezekiel felt a cold dread settle in his stomach at her tone, but he nodded for her to continue. Charlotte took a deep breath. "I wasn't entirely truthful in my letter or when I arrived." She couldn't meet his eyes now. "My father's business didn't simply fail. He was accused of fraud, of deliberately misleading investors." The words seemed to pain her physically. "He took his own life before the case went to trial, and my mother followed within the month." The scandal was significant. In Boston society, the Burke name became synonymous with dishonesty. Her voice had grown small, yet she continued with evident determination. "I lost everything: position, reputation, prospects. No respectable family would employ me as a teacher once they learned my name. Ezekiel remained silent, processing this revelation. Charlotte finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and fear. I understand if this changes things between us. If you feel I deceived you. She straightened her shoulders, preparing for judgment. I should have told you immediately, but I was afraid you would send me away before. She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Ezekiel considered her words carefully, understanding now her wariness, her fierce independence, her determination to prove her worth through constant labor. Did your father do what they claimed? He asked finally, his voice neutral. Charlotte shook her head slowly. I don't know. I truly don't. He never spoke of business troubles, even as they mounted. I want to believe he was innocent, that there was some mistake or misunderstanding, but she shrugged helplessly. I'll never know with certainty. Ezekiel was quiet for so long that Charlotte began to rise, perhaps assuming his silence was condemnation. His hand on her arm stopped her. When I came west, he said slowly, I left more than my home behind. Left my name, too. The one I was born with. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise. Cooper was my mother's family name. Took it because... He paused, the words difficult after so many years of silence. Because Ezekiel Harland died in Tennessee, along with his wife and children. Couldn't bear to be him anymore. Understanding dawned in Charlotte's expression. So we both came here remaking ourselves, she whispered. Ezekiel nodded, his hand still on her arm. Reckon that gives us something in common. His fingers moved to cover hers. Your father's choices aren't yours, Charlotte. Just as my past isn't who I am now. Out here, we're judged by what we do, not what came before. The trip to town the following day was markedly different from their previous visit. Spring had brought new settlers to the area, and Silver Ridge was bustling with activity. As they made their way down the main street, Charlotte walked confidently at Ezekiel's side, no longer the uncertain newcomer. At the general store, Mrs. Hollister greeted them with obvious surprise. Mrs. Cooper, we didn't expect to see you again after such a long winter up on that mountain. The woman's eyes moved between them, noting their easy proximity. Many of us thought you might have reconsidered your situation. Charlotte smiled pleasantly, though Ezekiel could see the steel beneath her polite expression. On the contrary, Mrs. Hollister, I found mountain life suits me remarkably well. She placed her hand deliberately on Ezekiel's arm. My husband has built a wonderful home, and we've had a most satisfactory winter becoming acquainted. Word of their apparent harmony spread quickly through the small town. As they loaded supplies into their wagon, Sheriff Taylor approached, tipping his hat with grudging respect. Cooper, Mrs. Cooper. His eyes lingered on Charlotte with something like confusion. Seems the mountain agrees with you, ma'am. You're looking well. Charlotte inclined her head. Thank you, Sheriff. I've found both the mountain and its master to be misunderstood treasures. The lawman's eyebrows rose at her deliberate choice of words, but he merely nodded and moved on. As they prepared to depart, a young woman approached their wagon hesitantly, introducing herself as the new schoolteacher. I was hoping, Mrs. Cooper, that you might consider visiting the school sometime. I understand you were a teacher back east. We have so few educated women in the territory, and I could use the guidance. Charlotte's face lit up with genuine pleasure at the unexpected request. I would be delighted, Miss Lawrence. Perhaps when we return next month? The ride home was lighter somehow, a new easiness between them. You enjoyed that, Ezekiel observed, noticing the smile that still played around Charlotte's lips, correcting their assumptions. She laughed softly, the sound still rare enough to catch his attention. "Perhaps a little," she admitted, "though I meant what I said, about finding treasures where others see only harshness." Her hand found his on the wagon seat, their fingers intertwining naturally. That evening, after unloading their supplies, they sat closer than usual before the fire, Charlotte's head resting against Ezekiel's shoulder, as they discussed plans for expanding the corral and possibly acquiring more livestock in the summer. When the time came to retire, Ezekiel walked her to her bedroom door, as had become their custom. But tonight, instead of the usual brief goodnight, Charlotte turned to face him, her expression serious yet unafraid. "I don't want to sleep alone tonight," she said simply, her amber eyes steady on his. "I don't want separate rooms between us anymore." Ezekiel's heart hammered against his ribs as he searched her face, finding no hesitation, only certainty. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. In answer, Charlotte rose on tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, a gentle, questioning kiss that rapidly deepened as decades of loneliness dissolved between them. Later, in the darkness of what was now truly their room, Charlotte traced the scars on his chest and asked questions he'd never answered for another soul. And Ezekiel, to his own amazement, found himself speaking of Tennessee, of the family he'd lost, of the guilt and rage that had driven him west. Charlotte listened without judgment, occasionally wiping tears from his weathered cheeks with tender fingers. When he finally fell silent, emotionally spent, she kissed him again and whispered, "Thank you for trusting me with your ghosts." Summer brought abundant growth to their expanded garden and a steady rhythm to their days. They rose with the sun, worked side by side through the morning hours, then sought shade during the hottest part of the day before resuming their labors in the cooler evening. Their nights were filled with a passion neither had expected to find at their stages of life, a deep physical and emotional connection that continued to strengthen. On Charlotte's monthly visits to the schoolhouse in town, Ezekiel accompanied her, gradually becoming a familiar, if still somewhat mysterious figure to the townspeople. He remained reserved by nature, but no longer actively cultivated the fear and distance that had once protected his solitude. When young Thomas Lawrence, the schoolteacher's brother, expressed interest in learning trapping techniques, Ezekiel surprised everyone, including himself, by agreeing to teach the boy. "You're changing," Charlotte observed one evening as they watched a summer thunderstorm from the porch, opening up like these mountain flowers after the snow melts. Ezekiel considered this. Maybe, he acknowledged, or maybe just returning to who I was before. He didn't need to complete the thought. She understood. Charlotte leaned against him, her body fitting perfectly against his side, in the way he'd come to treasure. "I never thought I'd find this," she admitted quietly. "After Boston, after everything, I hoped for security, maybe companionship. Never imagined." She gestured vaguely, encompassing their home, their life, the deep bond between them that had no need for conventional labels. Ezekiel turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "There's something I've been meaning to ask," he said, uncharacteristic nervousness in his voice. "We never had a proper ceremony, never stood before a preacher or signed papers. If you'd prefer to make things official in the eyes of the town, the law." He trailed off, watching her expression carefully. Charlotte's smile spread slowly, reaching her eyes in the way that still caught his breath. "Are you proposing to me, Ezekiel Cooper?" she asked, amusement and tenderness mingling in her voice. After all this time? He found himself smiling in return, the expression no longer feeling foreign on his face. "Reckon I am," he admitted. Though seems backwards, given we've been living as husband and wife these many months. Her hands tightened around his. I don't need a ceremony or papers to know what we are to each other, she said softly. But if it would please you, I would be honored to stand beside you before the preacher and make promises we've already kept. He nodded, bringing her hands to his lips. Next trip to town, then, they sealed the agreement with a kiss as lightning illuminated the valley below, briefly turning night to day. The wedding, when it came, was simple but meaningful. The small church in Silver Ridge was filled with more people than Ezekiel had expected. Charlotte's students and their parents, the young trapper Thomas and his sister, even Sheriff Taylor and his wife. Pastor Williams spoke of new beginnings and redemption, themes that resonated deeply with the couple standing before him. Charlotte wore a blue dress she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers from their meadow in her hair. Ezekiel had actually purchased a new shirt and had his hair properly trimmed for the occasion. When they exchanged vows, there was a depth to their promises that came from months of already living them, for better or worse, in sickness and health, tested and proven rather than merely hoped for. The celebration afterward at the hotel dining room was lively, with townsfolk who had once whispered about the strange mountain man now raising glasses to the couple's happiness. As evening approached, they said their goodbyes, eager to return to their mountain home. The autumn that followed was the most bountiful Ezekiel could remember. Their garden yielded abundant vegetables for preserving. His hunting brought in meat to smoke and cure for winter, and Charlotte's careful management ensured their pantry was well stocked. They had added 2 milk cows and more chickens to their homestead, making them nearly self-sufficient. On crisp October evenings, they would sit on their porch, watching golden aspen leaves flutter against the backdrop of evergreens, planning for the future in a way Ezekiel had never allowed himself to do in all his years alone. I've been thinking, Charlotte said during one such twilight conversation, about building an addition to the cabin, another room. Ezekiel nodded thoughtfully. Could use more storage space before winter sets in. Might be able to get the framework up before the heavy snows. Charlotte smiled, a secretive expression that caught his attention. I wasn't thinking of storage space, she said, her hand moving deliberately to rest on her still flat stomach. I was thinking we might need a nursery by spring. For a moment, Ezekiel didn't comprehend her meaning. When understanding dawned, he stared at her in stunned silence. Are you certain? He finally managed, his voice barely audible. Charlotte nodded, joy and nervousness mingling in her expression. The signs have been there for weeks. I wanted to be sure before I told you. Ezekiel's calloused hand covered hers where it rested, protective and wondering. I thought, at our ages, he began. Charlotte's eyes crinkled with amusement. Apparently, we're not as old as we believed ourselves to be, she replied. Or perhaps the mountain air is more invigorating than we realized. Ezekiel laughed, a full, rich sound that had become less rare in recent months. Then, with unexpected swiftness, he gathered Charlotte into his arms, lifting her from the bench and spinning her in a circle that drew a surprised squeal from her lips. Careful, she protested through her laughter. I'm in a delicate condition, or so I'm told. He set her gently on her feet, but kept his arms around her, one hand moving to rest reverently over their growing child. Never expected this, he whispered, emotion thickening his voice. A second chance at everything. Charlotte reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that had softened somewhat during their time together. That's what we've given each other, she said softly. A second chance neither of us thought possible. As they stood together in the gathering dusk, The mountain valley spread before them, and the promise of new life between them. Ezekiel remembered the letter that had arrived a year ago, a desperate gamble by two wounded souls seeking merely to escape the shadows of their pasts. What they'd found instead was healing, redemption, and a love that had transformed them both. Charlotte seemed to follow his thoughts, as she often could now. "Can you forgive me?" she asked, echoing the question she'd posed months ago after revealing her father's disgrace. But now the question held different meaning. Forgiveness for the secrets they'd both kept, for the walls they'd built, for the years spent believing second chances didn't exist for people like them. Ezekiel's answer came without hesitation, his arms tightening around the woman who had brought his heart back to life. "Nothing to forgive," he murmured against her hair, "only to be grateful for." If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.